Hello, my name is Ian Viabout, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I am joined by my friend Mike Lieto, who some of you may remember from the Deep Cuts days, or perhaps even the recent Bursting Out discussion that we did here with our buddy Jocko. Today, we're going to talk about King Crimson, and this was specifically inspired by a comment that I received on my review of the album The Construction of Light. And somebody posted a ranking of the King Crimson records, and I kind of sent that to you. And I was like, Mike, look at this. This is wild. Like, this guy says Red is like his least favorite.
That was wild. That was really wild to me.
Yeah. But it's like
fascinating.
It's fascinating. Yeah. And it's his opinion. And it's like, I was kind of glad that he shared it with us, even though it's like, wow.
So was I've never heard that take before. I appreciate it.
But it did get us to talking like, well, what are our favorite King Crimson records? And first we were going to do like a conventional ranking video. And then I thought, then we started talking about like, well, hey, let's talk about all of the albums. Let's do a review of all, 12, 13, depending on 13. Okay. I'm sure this is an issue with most King Crimson fans. Is that an album or not?
We're talking about the main albums too. Like if you talk about the full discography, there's a bazillion live albums. There's like 4 EPs. Another album that may or may not be King Crimson, the project albums, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. We are going to stick to the studio albums. I listened to each one of these studio albums in order of release. And this is the first time I've ever done this.
I did that also with you.
For any band. Yeah, and you did it with me. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with the first album, In the Court of the Crimson King, and we're going to provide a little mini review. How do we feel about it? And we're going to do this for each album. We're going to do this through The Power to Believe, 2003. So let's start with the beginning.
The iconic
Court of the Crimson King.
With, I think, the best album artwork, period.
Definitely. Barry Godber, who
Rest
died.
in peace,
Yeah, he died within, like a few weeks or months of painting it. It's a watercolor. Is that right? It's a
and it
watercolor?
only has 5 colors in it, which is amazing.
It's a self-portrait. Did you know that?
I did not know that, actually.
So it's got all this mystique and just legend around this record as soon as it's released.
In the Court of the Crimson King encapsulates the first era of King Crimson Mark I, which is Robert Fripp on guitar, Ian McDonald on saxophones and woodwinds, mellotron, Michael Giles on the drums, and Greg Lake on bass and vocals, and Peter Sinfield on words and stage lights and
lighting,
all sorts of stuff. Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. That band was essentially lightning in a bottle. They existed for, what was it, like 10 months or something, and then essentially dissipated. But my God, where did they make a splash and a half? And this album is the attempt to capture the amazing energy this group had in the studio. And it's very successful. But I was in 9th grade when I first heard King Crimson. This was not the first King Crimson record I heard, I don't think. But it is one that, made an immediate impression. I mean, how can you not hear 21st Century Schizoid Man for the first time and not be like, oh my God, what is this? It turns your entire world around. I can't tell you how many times I've spun this record. It's so important. There was a time in my life where this was the best album I've ever heard and was my favorite for quite a long time. It's still right up there. I think there's a few that kind of trump it now, but it's still, really important to me as a person. And plus I think Ian and I have been talking about this stuff a lot in preparation for this video. I think I share his opinion that In the Court of the Crimson King is my favorite song on here. It is such a perfect piece of music. There's, in my opinion, 3 Crimson records that completely changed the face of music, which is unbelievable for one band to have. But it's this one, Lark's Tongue and Aspic, and Discipline. And this one probably made the biggest notables, splash. Because I don't think I honestly share Robert Fripp's opinion that King Crimson really aren't a progressive rock band. They're their own thing. But this album started the prog genre, really. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's like, inklings and stuff that's kind of progressive before this. Like the Moody Blues are doing some really cool stuff, Procol Harum, bands like that. But when this came out, there was nothing like this. My only note on this album is to talk about Michael Giles and how unbelievable he is on the drum kit. He really, I think, shapes the entire musical landscape of this album.
Yeah.
The stuff he plays is groundbreaking.
The quality of a drum part is how easily it can be sung, sort of in the way that, like a melody would work for another instrument. And I think that Michael Giles' introduction to In the Court of the Crimson King is breathtaking. It's breathtaking music.
It is.
And I'm talking about just the fill. I feel much the same way you do. And I thought this was a good enough opportunity to show that I've been doing my homework. This is the complete 1969 recordings, and I'm currently fighting the glare. This is every recorded note that has survived, that exists, of the 1969 band. And that includes like 12 hours of recording sessions, live performances, the famous gig at Hyde Park. The Marquee gig is here too. It was the next night. But you also have 2 5.1 mixes and 1 Atmos mix of the album. So this is an incredible treasure trove of material. The mere presence of that in my collection should tell you what this album means to me. And the way that this album was introduced to me was, this is progressive rock. It was a case of, I was probably the same age you were, maybe a little younger, but it was over the summer. I was listening to music with my dad, and I said, is there anything else that you have that I might like? And he pulled a copy of this album down from the higher shelf and put it on. And I just remember that it was like, oh my God, like, this is music that I've only dreamed of. And I'm just talking about 21st Century Schizoid Man. That song alone was enough to grab me. And, that was the moment when I became addicted to progressive music. And that addiction lasted for years. And it's back too. That's the thing, is it's reoccurring. The first time I heard it, I remember being disappointed a little bit by the rest of the album because it's a little bit different speed. But obviously over the years, I grew to love every moment of it. Even Moonchild.
The song itself is so beautiful.
The song itself is beautiful. And I just recently had a chance to hear the full performance of that, the full unedited version of that, at least the unedited album version of it. And, it has this effect of allowing your mind to drift off. And so when that iconic drum part comes in, to me, it makes it even more, awe-inspiring, because you don't expect it. You're drifting off into, somewhere else, some other world. And then when Giles comes in with that fill, you're like, oh man, there's so much that's been said about this record over the years. And I even did a review of it. There's not much to add to it. But I will say that I did have a chance to go back and listen to some of the live versions of this material. And it kind of struck me, because I always thought of Epitaph as being like a dirge, like a funeral dirge. But when you hear the live versions, it comes off more bluesy, which I find fascinating. And it's like they took a blues song and like the progression is bluesy. They took a blues song and slowed it down, and in the process sort of created doom music for the first time, because you kind of have to remember that this is 1969 and everybody's full of optimism and hope for the future. Basically, Charles Manson hadn't happened yet. That's the moment where everything becomes dark, when we realize, oh, wait a minute, LSD isn't going to save the world. And, to release something dark and foreboding and doomy at this time was completely off the wall. Nobody else had done anything like that up until that point. But man, there was a lot of imitators afterward. That's for sure.
Oh yeah. I mean, you're right. This is the first instance of something that's like, like you said, like really doomy and like pessimistic,
Yeah.
kind of like apocalyptic in a way. I mean,
Yeah.
also the lyrics are beautiful, but they are, like you're in a torture chamber in the king's court, or Epitaph has this like Epitaph's gorgeous, but it
It
also has
is.
this imagery of like people being like hung on a planet somewhere, and like it's like the end of the world kind of thing. The wall on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. It's like
Yeah.
everything's falling apart.
Yeah.
It's really special in that way. At least when it came out, it was, peerless, really.
I dearly love this record. It's one of my all-time favorites, and we'll get to the ranking, but there's only maybe one or two others that I may rank above this, and
Me too.
It's just totally personal preference and experience, and I think that this record does a good job of setting the tone of what King Crimson in the future would be. A lot of, similar way to maybe the way Frank Zappa and the Mothers Freak Out does. It's sort of like the mission statement for the next couple of decades for Frank. Court of the Crimson King is sort of similar because, you have a mixture of styles. You have up-tempo songs, you have a dirgy track, you have, light elfin music, almost like Fairport Convention, even though they could be very dark too, with I Talk to the Wind. You also have the improv, and the improv thing is something that's a theme that carries through every King Crimson record. Almost every single one has a little bit of that sort of free improvisation, and it's something that they got better at.
There are certain groups of people who are somewhat close to what King Crimson is, but there are only one King Crimson, right?
Yeah.
And King Crimson is a way of doing things. It could be, it seems to be always Robert Fripp, but also it could be with any number of other people, as we're going to find out very soon.
Yeah.
But it's the way of doing things. It's the way that the people play music together, and as Fripp calls it, like the muse of music comes down and, takes over what's happening with you and becomes something else. That's King Crimson. And
Right.
a lot of times it happens in improvisation. It happens in the band like fleshing out a composition together. It's a collective thing that becomes the King Crimson. It's not just, one guy shining down his influences. This guy is a catalyst with other people, then they together create a King Crimson. And it has a specific quality, which does have stuff that pulls from classical music, a lot of jazz and improv, a lot of bluesy rock, but also together is Crimson.
Yeah.
And I really like that about them too. It's not just like it's a band playing this kind of music. They're playing King Crimson because it's what the process is and what the band is doing, not what the band is called.
There's no star, there's no front man. I mean, there may be somebody who holds a position that is like a front man, but for the most part, the music is the front man.
Mm-hmm.
The music is the star. Everything is meant to be in service, and you'll see this when we talk about future albums. Where Fripp imposes a lot of restrictions upon what people play. Bill Bruford, spoiler, in order to keep that balance in check. This is the beginning of a remarkable set of albums. So album number 2, In the Wake of Poseidon. This is Fripp in crisis. I mean, we're going to be Fripp in crisis for a couple of records here, but this is the beginning of the crisis because the original King Crimson lineup imploded in America.
Mm-hmm.
They just had enough of it, I think. And part of that is that this band were incredibly successful very quickly. And I think that, you'll see that with a couple of future King Crimson lineups that they peak really fast. And then there's also the inevitable and decline that comes after that.
Giles and McDonald got tired of touring so quick in the States, and they missed home, and they just announced that they were going to leave King Crimson right before the last show at the Fillmore West in 1969, like December. And then King Crimson ceased to exist essentially right after that. But they Fripp wanted to record an album. So he asked Greg Lake to stay on and Michael Giles to record the album in the studio. And they said yes, thankfully. And, what we get out of that little nugget of an idea is In the Wake of Poseidon. Yeah, it also features a couple of new King Crimson members, or may not be members. It's kind of fluid at this point. Like
Yeah.
this goes back to what I said about a way of doing things, right? Because King Crimson really isn't a band at this point, but it's people making King Crimson music.
Yeah. It's Tippett
Yeah.
and what is it? Phil Tippett?
Yeah, Keith Tippett.
Keith Tippett. Phil
Yeah,
Tippett was the
he was
model guy on Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
Keith Tippett.
Yeah. In addition to Fripp and Greg Lake and Michael Giles, you have Keith Tippett on pianos, who essentially joined King Crimson at this point. Keith Tippett is also like a more of a free jazz kind of piano player, which is very evident in his playing. He also did a few like progressive and again Canterbury leaning projects alongside this. So you also have Peter Giles on bass, who comes back just to record this album.
Yeah.
Mel Collins on saxes and flutes, who I think also joins the band at this point. Gordon Haskell sings one track, who will be way more important on the next record, and then Peter Sinfield stays as the wordsmith for this album, which came out in early 1970.
Some people will say that it's a stylistic copy and paste of the debut album, and part of this might be that so much of it was performed by the 1969 King Crimson, such as Pictures of a City. Cadence and Cascade is a remake of a Giles and Fripp track.
Yes.
The peace theme, that comes from the Giles Fripp sessions. And, of course, The Devil's Triangle was performed as Mars by the 1969 King Crimson. And it was terrifying.
Yeah. It's a Gustav Holst piece that is scary beyond belief.
Yeah,
it's like unreal music.
On this album, they kind of turned it into a music concrete piece. And it's horrifying, but I still think that the staccato rhythm, everybody playing the same thing together of the 1969 live versions, is a little scarier.
I agree.
Than the album version. It's just a little bit more ominous.
I do think The Devil's Triangle is better than its reputation. A lot of people don't like that.
Oh, I like it.
I think it's great. I think it's one of those like psychedelic experiments from like the late 60s, early 70s, like Interstellar Overdrive, which is also very successful. But countless other examples from other bands, but this is one of the better ones. I think it's very successful at what it does. It like kind of makes you feel like you're lost at sea falling into the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah.
While you're listening to Gustav Holst become completely destroyed as the record goes on. And there's that like haunting, like horn, like ship horn sound right in the middle. It's very cool. It's a really unique experience. There's nothing else quite like that in the Crimson catalog. That's for sure.
And I mentioned this in my comparison video, but my favorite little moment of The Devil's Triangle is when Keith Tippett is doing like the cat food runs across the piano.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
And you hear a little bit of Greg Lake singing the chorus of In the Court of the Crimson King, and then it immediately gets smashed.
Yeah.
like with a hammer.
So good.
It's like, well, we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah. I really like that leads into like I really like what you say about this album too. It's kind of like it's like a transition. It really is like a true transition record, right? Because like the first
says too.
Because the first half is it isn't the same exactly as the first album, but Pictures of a City is kind of like 21st Century Schizoid Man. I also really like Pictures of a City, and I think the guitar the parts in that song are way more challenging than the first one. And then you get another ballad, and then you get Wake of Poseidon, which is a epitaph-like song. I think it's different, and I also think it's
different.
I'm a huge fan of that song. It's gorgeous.
It slips into my subconscious, and I start thinking about it, and it'll just run through my mind. I'm like, oh, maybe that's better than I initially gave it credit.
Yeah, I think it's like maybe a little too long, like 1 minute too long. But besides that, I think it's amazing. It maybe has Greg Lake's best singing on a record. In my opinion,
yeah.
God, it's amazing. But after that, you get like the weird stuff, which I think switches into like more Lizard territory. Like you get Cat Food, which is an awesome song and a single. The Weirdo song, which is half of Lizard. The next album is Weirdo songs that are successful. The Devil's Triangle, and then it ends with the acoustic number, The End of Peace. There aren't really, I don't think, any other albums like this in the Crimson catalog, because they don't really transition much after the early years. Poseidon is, we're going to get to rankings and subjective stuff later, but it's better than its reputation. A lot of people don't like this one.
Yeah.
And I disagree. I think it's a really good record. Honestly, King Crimson had, except for like maybe 2 albums, they're all like really amazing. But I think this is a really good record. Very underrated. The one that definitely need to spin more, especially the Wilson mix, because I think Wilson does wonders with this mix, like he does with every Crimson album. I mean, every mix he's done is really eye-opening. Like this.
Well,
is
as
like
we pointed out, and this was before we were on air, so to speak, but this is one of the few examples where Wilson shares billing on the
with
mixes.
Fripp. Yeah,
with Fripp. Yeah, Fripp is credited on all these mixes. So I find that really, really interesting. Okay, so we
3.
move on to the third record, the very colorful Lizard album, which I've always had an opinion on this record, apparently. Some of you may be able to dig back far enough into the Prague Magazine archives and find that I submitted a review of this that was printed. So perhaps through the magic of editing and stagecraft, we shall superimpose my review for 5 quick seconds so you can't read it. This is a weird album, isn't
This
it?
is I had another one of my favorite album arts.
Oh, yeah.
This is probably my second favorite, because the first one is timeless, but this is just so cool. I mean, it's the letters King Crimson with all of this, some medieval imagery, some like 1970 imagery. It's
Beatles.
Really detailed. The Beatles are here. It's so cool.
Well, I believe that the cover is meant to represent each one of the album's tracks.
It does. And it fits well, yeah.
So the circus, obviously. The Beatles are Happy Family.
Lady of the Dancing Water is under R. So again, Lizard is another shift. This is their second album from 1970. So 1970 is the first year where they released 2 albums. This album, again, has very different personnel from the Wake of Poseidon. We got Robert Fripp again, of course. You got Mel Collins back on flute saxes. Gordon Haskell is now the main singer and bass player. You have Andy McCulloch on drums, and you have Pete Sinfield on words and pictures. That's the King Crimson band. But on this album, there's a lot of horns and woodwinds, and they are played by Robin Miller, who plays oboe, and Cor Anglais, who was one of the principal oboists for the London Symphony at the time under Pierre Boulez, which is pretty incredible.
That's incredible.
Mark Sherrick on cornet, Nick Evans on trombone, Keith Tippett on piano and all the pianos, and a cameo from John Anderson of Yes, singing the first movement of the title track, which is amazing. Mark Sherrick and Nick Evans are pretty big session players in England at the time. They played on a lot of like prog leaning stuff. Several Canterbury albums feature their terrific playing on them as well. So Lizard is, yes, it's a weird album, but it's one that I've always loved. I'm one of those weird people that really likes Lizard.
The weird lizard people.
Yeah, this is the second album that we've seen so far that is at one time been a favorite of mine. There was a time in my life where this was my favorite King Crimson album.
Mine
it's
too.
Still up there. Yeah, I love it. It's half the album is these like, it's really jazz infused. And I'm if you guys didn't know already, guys and gals didn't know, I am a huge jazz person. And this album is loaded with like free jazz and horns, and that's right up my alley. It's like bread and butter for me.
Yeah.
And it's got that stuff with some tons of mellotron, real weirdo songs in the first half, and then there's the epic Lizard title track with lots of experimental, synthesizers, and with the really awesome horn and woodwind improvisations in the second movement that I love to pieces. There's great lyrics. I was reading in either a line of notes or somewhere someone saying that this is probably the most experimental King Crimson record, and I think that may be true. It was Wilson saying that, and I think he's right. Like, there's nothing that sounds like this. It's a really unique and strange album, and I love it for that.
To me, it's a flawed gem. To borrow a phrase from Jethro Tull, I feel like the sound of the VSC3 synthesizer is a defining characteristic of the first side of this record.
Yes.
Whereas the woodwinds, Mark Cherig, etc., are the defining characteristic of side 2 to me. And the VSC3, I just saw a great documentary by Rail NYC, a YouTube channel here that I watch pretty often. And he did a documentary on Pink Floyd's Obscured by Clouds. And he was talking about how they and King Crimson were one of the, a couple of the first bands to use the VSC3. And there was quite a learning curve to kind of figure out what the heck does this thing even do? And it was expensive. So I can kind of see, this band, dropping a huge sum of money on this in 1970 and then being like, well, we're going to use it.
Oh, wow.
Let's put it all over the album. And there's really no other King Crimson synthesizer record to speak of. And that's not really what this is. It's only the first side of it that is, the first half of it. But I think that's what's unique about it, is that the use of the synthesizer. And a lot of these sounds are quite, to my ear, pioneering for the time, such as some of the really dark, foreboding sounds that you hear on Circus, which is one of my favorite, oddball King Crimson songs. Just in general, I think it's a great opener. But you also hear it on the opening of Indoor Games, that bleep. And there's moments of this record where it almost sounds like everybody's trying to play on top of each other, but it never quite loses its cohesion for me until maybe the last 3 minutes of the suite. And this album, I like it. I like it a lot. But it's that last few minutes of the suite. It doesn't quite stick the landing for me. And I think that's what will forever make this kind of a somewhere in the middle, King Crimson record. It's not their worst by any stretch, but it's got flaws.
Yeah, it's definitely not perfect.
Some of Robin Miller's oboe playing, especially
Stellar.
in the what is that part of the suite called?
Is it the bolero?
Yeah, the bolero. Robert Fripp makes a comment that melody has carried him through some difficult times, and I can agree. I can agree with that, because this is beautiful. It's heart-achingly beautiful.
I love Lady of the Dancing Water. It is such a beautiful little song. Something about it is special. It really speaks to me. And Happy Family is a song that it's almost like the band sounds like they're falling down the stairs, but it's controlled. Who the heck would release something like that? It is so cool. It's really one of the weirdest songs in the whole catalog. I really like it, but it is really one of the out there numbers. Yeah. I think want to say I love Circus too, but I don't think any of the live versions come from any bands that try to perform it come close to this version. I don't know, something about the studio version of this that really leans into the menacing creepiness of the Circus itself. Yeah. And I don't think the live versions kind of match it. It's almost like Tedium live for some reason for me, but in the studio it's great. And it's maybe one of the only Crimson songs that I feel that way about. A lot of times they elevate their material on stage, but maybe not with this song. But that's my take.
Why did Gordon Haskell join King Crimson?
I think Robert might have asked him to join, because he did not have a good time.
No. And he even commented back, because Gordon saw some of the early concerts, and he even commented that it wasn't for him, that doomy stuff wasn't for him. He was a hippie.
He was terrified. Yeah.
And so, you have him just breaking into laughter at some of this stuff and almost refusing to sing it.
Yeah. Crazy.
But he's got a decent voice for this material. So I get why Robert would want to collaborate with him too, but I just always wondered, what the heck? If he hates it so much, why is he there?
I think it works for this album. His voice does work for this material for sure. It's hard for me to imagine somebody else singing this. Boz Burrell, I don't think would work for this, and I don't think Greg Lake. Well, maybe Greg Lake, but I don't know. I think he's a good fit for this oddball of an album. Yeah, and that's Lizard. It's I love it, but it's real weird.
So album number 4. Usually, most bands, I would say, take 3 albums and experiment and find their sound. And then by album 4, they've arrived. Usually album 4 is the big one for most bands. Is Islands the big album for King Crimson? Is this where King Crimson arrive?
No.
It's very tired. I hear exhaustion when I listen to this album, and I feel exhaustion when I listen to it.
It's really spacious. It's so spacious, it's kind of empty. I think this is the point where I think we're really going to start to, I don't know, irk people, but like I know some people really love this album, and more power to them. But I'm not one of those. Neither of us are one of those people.
Yeah, I used to.
I used to really like it too. I think the band is great, and this is not an accurate portrait of this band. This version of Crimson was pretty awesome on stage.
Yeah.
When they wanted to, they can really let loose. But it's, almost nowhere on this album, unfortunately. I like half the songs. I really like Sailor's Tale, and I love The Letters. The Letters is, for me, a very underrated Crimson song, and the title track is great. But every single song on here that's performed live was better live than in this album. Yeah. Like for me, Formentera Lady kind of falls apart halfway through. I don't like Ladies of the Road. I think it's one of the worst King Crimson songs. Song of the Gulls is a nice, like early 1800s classical kind of string quartet, which is nice.
Giles.
It's another Giles and Fripp thing. Wow.
So is The Letters.
I love the lyrics on Islands too, but the lyrics on Ladies of the Road are probably the worst in the whole catalog.
Yep.
As we were saying before, this might be the one where Sinfield influences, doesn't work so much for Crimson anymore.
Well, let me put it this way. It's no Man with an Open Heart.
Yeah.
I think my hot take is that The Letters is my favorite song. And I think that Sailor's Tale is outstanding within the context of Islands, but in the broader context of great Crimson workouts, it's not my favorite. And that I'm guessing that people are going to really disagree with me on that. And here's the thing: is I have heard maybe 10 seconds of this band live in recent memory. I used to have Live at the Marquee 1971, and I liked that set, but I don't remember anything about it now. So I can only go by the album, and
there are better documents also of that band.
I'm sure there are. I mean, I heard a little bit of the performance. I think that you had recommended, and I thought that that was a lot better. But my feeling is that the band were spread too thin at this point, creatively and professionally as well. But I think that I remember reading that Robert was like getting 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night or something like that. And, he was recording, he was playing live, and he was writing out parts as he's waking up in the morning and stuff. And his exhaustion shows, the band's exhaustion shows.
This is the King Crimson that would go out on stage after this album. This is the first time they performed live since the original band. And, it's Robert and Mel Collins, but you got Boz Burrell, who sings and plays bass, and Fripp taught him the bass, which is super interesting. That dude really had a hard job. My goodness, they'll play bass with this group. And then you have Ian Wallace on the drum kit, who's a jazz drummer. But you get the returning Mark Charig and Robin Miller on this album too, and Keith Tippett. Plus you get Paulina Lucas, who sings soprano voice, and Harry Miller, who plays string bass on Formentera Lady, which is a really nice color for King Crimson, honestly. I like the opening with the string bass. It's nothing quite like that anywhere else in this catalog.
And Steven Wilson's mix of this one repaired an issue. There was always like a weird scratch or something on that opening, and like that's gone. So it's really nice to hear it cleaned up and treated so lovingly. But this is one case where I find this album a difficult listen. Like I cannot actually sit down and listen to it all the way through. And there's really only one other King Crimson album that I would say that about. We'll get to that a little while later. The only thing to say is that I like The Letters. but I like the Giles and Giles and Fripp versions better. I like the 1969 live versions better, where it's just titled Drop In. It's just too scattered, and it just doesn't come together. It's like it's like the opposite of Happy Family, where it's scattered in a good way. This is scattered in a bad way.
The letters comes alive, I think, when the most recent Crimson, like the 7 and 8 headed monsters, they play the letters. I think it rips at that point. But it's another example of all the material on here, in our opinion, is nowhere near as good as the live stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so that concludes the first part of our King Crimson studio album discussion. When Mike and I recorded this conversation, the first rough cut was nearly 3 hours long. So I have decided to cut it up into parts and release these one at a time. So if you enjoyed this, look for part 2 next week, in which we will discuss the John Wetton era, that being the albums Lark's Tongues and Aspic, Starless and Bible Black, and Red. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for further updates and to see our eventual ranking. And also feel free to comment. Let us know what you think of our discussion so far. If you agree or disagree with us, we'd love to hear from you. And lastly, don't forget to like the video. That's a thumbs up. And show your appreciation. All right, my name's Ian Beabout, and you will hear from me real soon. Bye-bye.